The final item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 5533 in the name of Bob Doris on Dr David Livingstone's bicentenary. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could please press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. I call on Bob Doris to open the debate. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to host this debate on the legacy of David Livingstone, who would have been 200 next Tuesday.
Mr Doris, sorry, could you check that your microphone is...
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much.
This is fast becoming Malawi March in the Parliament, with the state visit by President Joyce Banda next week, and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association reception the week after that. Indeed, James Kelly, who is present here this evening, will also be having a debate on the theme later this month. Can I say that the inspiration, other than the legacy of David Livingstone, for having this debate was in Councillor Bert Thompson, the local councillor for Blantyre, who told me of his fondness for the connection with David Livingstone in the Blantyre area he represents, and his experiences as a boy, which I'm sure wasn't that long ago, Councillor Thompson, in relation to the work carried out. Also, Jim Hume has a strong family connection in relation to David Livingstone, and a number of members in this chamber here today have a strong connection with Malawi and have done a lot of work on that. I'd like to pay tribute to everyone in relation to that here this afternoon. So, by way of an introduction, I'd like to reflect on Scotland's special relationship with Malawi, the most enduring legacy of Dr Livingstone, undoubtedly one of the most renowned Scots of the 19th century, and surely Blantyre's most famous son. Unlike his devout Sunday school teaching father, Livingstone was convinced of the compatibility of religion and science, and hoped to use one to advance the other through his emphasis, although his emphasis was always more on exploration and humanitarian concerns than straight missionary work. It was the latter which led Kenneth Kaunda, the first president of Zambia, to describe Livingstone as Africa's first freedom fighter. A staunch opponent of slavery, he believed strongly that promoting enterprise and commerce would help to bring social justice, self-government, and light to what was still then unfortunately described in Europe as the Dark Continent. It was his navigation of the Zambezi River on just such an expedition which took him in the 1870s to what is now Malawi. This visit opened up the interior of the Sub-Sahara to European trade and watered the seeds which have flowered into the modern nation of Malawi. He established a trade settlement there, which has now grown into the country's commercial capital, and Livingstone's influence is made plain by its name of Blantyre. Malawi became independent in 1964, but has retained its close links with the UK and Scotland in particular. These were particularly fostered by Jack McConnell as First Minister, and what was really the first high-profile international engagement by a devolved Scottish administration, which I think represented a coming of age for the Parliament and the then Executive. The cooperation agreement signed in 2005 between the Scottish and Malawian administrations codifies the role of the Scottish Government in international development in Malawi in the areas of health, education, the economy and governance. Currently, under the agreement, the Scottish Government ring-fences a minimum of £3 million from its International Development Fund for projects in Malawi, though since 2010 I am delighted to say the average has been around £4.5 million per year. So the bicentenary offers a chance to build on this fantastic legacy. A number of grassroots and Scottish Government-supported activities are being held throughout the year, both here and in Africa, to mark the anniversary. Perhaps most significantly, Zambia, arguably the country most influenced by Livingstone after Malawi, is hosting the Livingstone 2013 Festival, part of which involves an exchange programme with Scotland for medical students at Zambia's Livingstone Hospital. This will allow the countries to share expertise in particularly appropriate fields, given Livingstone's background. The David Livingstone Bicentenary Scholarship Programme, which I mentioned in my motion, is a central part of that legacy. In researching for this debate, I was surprised to find that Malawi has the lowest rate of university enrolment in the world. Only 51 of 100,000 Malawians are in higher education, and of these, most are in the liberal arts courses. While this in many ways is a positive sign that this is a field for study, suggesting improving standards of living and the emergence of a middle class, it is also important that Malawian universities produce graduates with the skills to contribute directly to the country's economic and social development. The £100,000 programme funded by the Scottish Government and managed by the Scottish Malawi Partnership will help to support up to 50 gifted but underprivileged Malawians through a master's degree. Although the scholarship is a one-off, if done right, it should have benefits which endure long after the bicentenary year. To achieve this, I understand the Scottish Malawi Partnership are still fleshing out the details of this. One of the criteria for the award of the grant could be that applicants contribute via their studies to the wider community, perhaps by teaching in a school or working in the development sector. In this way, the investment will have a knock-on effect beyond those students who directly benefit. The National Trust's David Livingstone Centre, based at Livingstone's Childhood Home in Blantyre, is at the heart of the bicentenary celebrations, and I am pleased to welcome some of their staff to the Chamber today also. More than 80 years after its establishment, it was awarded official museum accreditation this year, and I know the Centre are hopeful that another legacy of the bicentenary will be a major programme of repair and refurbishment of the buildings in the years ahead. Next week, on the bicentenary itself, children from local primary schools in Blantyre will bury a time capsule at the centre. This will contain a mixture of historical materials, some of it provided by a primary school in Malawi, and later that day the centre will unveil one of Livingstone's newly discovered diaries. I pay special tribute to the centre for this. I think that teaching children about and encouraging them to participate in the legacy of Livingstone is a wonderful way of ensuring that the special links between Scotland and Malawi remain strong into the next generation, and I hope for centuries to come. Presiding Officer, in closing, I'd like to say it's a privilege that as a MSP for Glasgow region, the boundaries were changed to include Blantyre within that region. It certainly enriches the geographical area that I represent, but David Livingstone's legacy enriches Scotland, it enriches Malawi, it enriches the world, and I am sure in 200 years from today we will be celebrating David Livingstone's 400th birthday, and those bonds will be stronger than ever. I propose the motion before us this afternoon, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to the open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. James Kelly, to be followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this evening's members' debate, and I'd like to start by congratulating Bob Doris on securing this important debate celebrating the life of David Livingstone. I'm also pleased to see Jim Hume in the Chamber, who looks as if he's set to contribute to the debate, because Jim is a direct descendant of David Livingstone, and I have no doubt that his contribution will give a particular insight and will no doubt enrich the debate. I want to concentrate on the links of David Livingstone to Blantyre, the legacy of Livingstone, and the relevance of his story to Blantyre today. There's no doubt that even if you look at Blantyre today, at some of the school names, David Livingstone Primary and the David Livingstone Centre that Bob Doris mentioned, that his memory is alive and well in the community of Blantyre. And there's no doubt that that's because what a remarkable story it is when you look at his upbringing in Blantyre. It really is an inspiration. He worked in a mill from the age of 10, starting at 6 o'clock in the morning till late at night, a 14-hour day, and such was the drive of David Livingstone and his family that he would then spend 2 hours reading in a very poor lit accommodation in order to educate himself. And when he secured that place at Glasgow University, he used to leave every Monday to go to Glasgow University, and he walked the 8 miles from Blantyre, and that shows you the drive and the inspiration of the man. And that education at Glasgow University built the platform for the life he was then to go on to lead. And if you look at the history of that, you know, there were a number of really important strands to it. He was obviously an experienced explorer, and encountering 3 trips over a 30-year period. He had a real strong Christian faith, which he looked to take to Africa, and that is alive and well in Blantyre today in the Livingstone Memorial Church, which every year, not just this year in the bicentennial, holds an annual service. And he was also a strong anti-slavery campaigner, in his saying in his famous Glasgow University address in 1758, hitting out against the horrid system of slavery. I think there are important lessons that Blantyre takes forward today. It's an area that's a really strong community, which goes back to the time of the mills when Livingston's family worked, and also the mines. Not forgetting that around the time of Livingston's death, there were 207 people lost their life in the Dixon's Pit mining disaster in Blantyre, and that history is still very much lives with people today. Blantyre, like other areas, has faced difficult times in recent years, but there is a really strong community there, and some of the principles that David Livingstone followed have been followed through by those in that community. There's real perseverance, there's respect for different areas of the community, and that's taken forward by St Blaine's, the local primary school, who, working with Nil by Mouth, have got an important project on anti-sectarianism, and they're using that to reach out to all areas of the community. And all the community groups in Blantyre, there's a real sense of improvement, and I think that's something that Livingstone himself would really have approved of. He was all for people doing better and improving the quality of their life. So in looking to Livingstone's life, it really is an inspiration. We're proud to be able to have the opportunity tonight to look at that past. The legacy of David Livingstone lives on, and the flame of his ideals burn brightly.
Thank you very much. I now call Maureen Watt to be followed by Alex Ferguson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I also congratulate Bob Doris in securing this timely debate and look forward to a busy 2 weeks ahead as we celebrate the bicentenary of Livingstone's birth. Can I wish Sarah Boyack and Alex Ferguson a safe and productive visit to Malawi next week as they take forward the work that we do in this Parliament through the CPA in trying to enrich and enhance the democratic capabilities of the MPs in the Parliament in Malawi, and I hope you can take the good wishes of us to them. I was privileged to visit Malawi on that same work in January 2011, and now as convener of the cross-party group on Malawi, I obviously keep a close eye on what is happening there. David Livingstone was indeed a remarkable man, as James Kelly said, working as a child in his early teens, but continuing learning to better himself. And he was deeply religious too. But he wasn't your standard imperialist explorer. He worked to protect the interests of the tribes he came across. And while he did evangelise as a missionary, apparently he didn't manage that many conversions. But he didn't force his beliefs on those he came across, and he was far more motivated by the prospect of exploration, scientific discovery, and most importantly, ending slavery. He believed he needed to find an easy route into the centre of the continent to bring legitimate trade as an alternative to the slave trade. He campaigned tirelessly against slavery and worked to spread the knowledge of the horrors of slavery back home in the UK. In particular, he reported on the Nyangwe massacre, where slave traders fired into a crowded market and 400 people were killed. It was British pressure, in part due to Livingstone's efforts, which led the Sultan of Zanzibar to make the slave trade illegal on the east coast of Africa. Unlike many other missionaries, he remained respected as a great humanitarian in the areas he travelled, and as a doctor he was able to provide medical aid to people he met, helping win their trust. He was one of the first to administer quinine in doses considered to be effective today, and suggested early on that mosquitoes were associated with malaria. And I think for these reasons he is still deeply respected in Malawi and so well known. Everyone you meet can tell you something about David Livingstone. And I think it's this basis for the deeply held relationship between our two countries. Through the CPG, we learned so much about the projects that Scotland's civil society undertakes in Malawi. But I'd like to point out that behind every good man there's a good woman, and an often ignored element of Dr Livingstone's story is his wife Mary, who is often known by her maiden name, Mary Moffat. She was born in Africa, and her father was a missionary too, famous for protecting the interests of natives. Moffat crossed the Kalahari, imagine this, while pregnant, and was in fact the first white woman to cross the Kalahari, and she accompanied David Livingstone on many other of his strenuous expeditions, often with her family in tow. She died from malaria after rejoining Livingstone in Africa following a period of living in Great Britain. So I think we should recognise her sacrifices too, which played a crucial role in enabling Livingstone to make his mark in history.
Thank you very much. I now call Alec Ferguson to be followed by Christina McKelvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As others have done, can I congratulate Bob Doris in securing this debate, but perhaps apologise to him and the rest of the Chamber that I have not actually signed it. I didn't realise that until this afternoon. I thought I had. I will put that right, albeit it's a question of better late than never. But I am delighted to be taking part in this debate, one that is a mere 6 days short of the 200th anniversary of the birth of surely one of the most remarkable men in Scotland's history, a history that already abounds with remarkable figures. As we've already heard, David Livingstone was born in Blantyre into the most humble of surroundings, and by the age of 10 was working up to 12 hours a day in the cotton mills, with school lessons to be attended in the evenings. And it surely says everything about this extraordinary man that his thirst for knowledge overcame his physical fatigue to such an extent that he became a voracious reader at a young age, who, despite his father's strong belief that theology and science should not be mixed, decided at the age of 23 to study medicine and theology in Glasgow, and eventually deciding to become a missionary doctor. And, of course, it was in that exact capacity that he found himself posted in 1845 to the edge of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. And he soon became convinced that he actually had a mission in life to reach new peoples in the interior of the vast continent of Africa and to introduce them to Christianity and, notably, as others have mentioned, to free them from slavery. And I think his anti-slavery stance is one which was notable in its robustness for the day. And indeed, it was this firm belief that inspired and encouraged him to undertake the explorations across Africa, for which he rightly became famous, during which he discovered the Victoria Falls in 1855, and the following year became the first European to cross the width of southern Africa. And what I find fairly remarkable about his expeditions was that, unlike others of the time, which usually, in fact almost always, involved large numbers of soldiers and other armed personnel for security reasons, Livingstone's always consisted of just small numbers of people that clearly constituted no threat to anyone. And I can't help but feel that that is why he was usually greeted with enthusiasm and respect by local chiefs and tribes, who he in turn respected every bit as much as they did him. And he lectured on and extolled the virtues of Christianity, but again, unlike other explorers and missionaries of the time, did not try and impose it on people against their wills if he met with resistance. And I don't think there's any doubt that that is what really explains the revered way in which he is still remembered, that Maureen Watt in particular has mentioned across Africa to this day. When the Malawian High Commissioner to the UK, His Excellency Mr Bernard Sandé, visited the Scottish Parliament recently, I had the great pleasure of meeting him along with Sarah Boyack, with whom I will be visiting Malawi later this week and next week on behalf of the CPA Scotland branch. And I thank Maureen Watt for her kind words, and I will take the good wishes of this Parliament. We will take the good wishes of this Parliament with us. But His Excellency told us that he had visited the David Livingstone Centre in Blantyre the day before we met him, and that he'd been virtually transfixed by being in those surroundings to such an extent that he could hardly bear to tear himself away, and indeed he overstayed his scheduled visit by over an hour, I believe. He was quite clearly deeply moved by the experience, and I have to say that that deep level of feeling that is still held for David Livingstone right across Africa is partly why I'm so pleased to be taking part in this debate tonight. Commemorations of this nature do not always commemorate parts of our history of which we which do us great justice if we're being perfectly honest. But any commemoration of David Livingstone is a commemoration of everything that is best about Scotland's pioneering past. And that's why I particularly welcome the Scottish Government's intention to fund a bicentenary scholarship programme. David Livingstone realised at an early age that education and knowledge produced the only real way to loosen the chains of poverty and slavery. So how fitting it is that we should celebrate the 200th anniversary of his birth by seeking to further that empowerment, even in a small way, through this scholarship programme. As the motion before us says, it will help the long-term continuation of Livingstone's legacy, a legacy of which we can all surely be immensely proud. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Christina McKelvey, to be followed by Jim Hume.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I take this opportunity to congratulate my friend and colleague Bob Doris in securing this debate? A very timely and important debate in the year that we celebrate the bicentenary of the birth of Dr David Livingstone. And colleagues will be aware that this is a subject very close to my heart too. I believe David Livingstone gave much more to the world than he took out. Presiding Officer, when I was a child growing up in the East End of Glasgow, I was treated to a school visit to the David Livingstone Centre in Blantyre. That triggered for me a lifelong interest in the life and work of a remarkable man. The search for the source of the Nile fascinated me and led to the dreams of sailing the Nile all the way to the pyramids as a child. A few years ago, with my sons, I did sail that Nile from Luxor to Aswan and we visited the pyramids too. So for that wee lassie for Easter House, we managed to realise that dream. I've also had the great pleasure to visit Malawi, an absolutely fantastic country, a beautiful country, and I wish them well in their celebrations too. It was a great adventure we had, and an adventure I think I will remember forever. But I wonder if Dr Livingstone decided, when he decided to travel to Africa, he thought about the dangers that adventures would pose, about the plants and the animals and the different people he would see and meet. I wonder if he thought 200 years later that we would hold him in such reverence and be celebrating his remarkable life and work. One thing I remember about Livingstone was in his many letters and diaries and journals, and I've had the great privilege of seeing some of his diaries first-hand at the Visitors Centre. He was talking and writing very much about the horror of people trafficking and the slave trade, something you will know of my involvement with the cross-party group in trafficking is something that we still have today, very, very sadly. He had a great spirit, and it's that spirit, the spirit of equality, fairness and justice, that took David Livingstone to Africa in 1840. In a letter to the editor of the New York Herald, Livingstone wrote, "And if my disclosures regarding the terrible Ugesian slavery should lead to the suppression of the East Coast slave trade, I shall regard that as a greater matter by far than the discovery of all the Nile sources together." What a powerful reason for writing to newspapers and raising awareness of the inhumanity of the slave trade. Livingstone is remembered very fondly in Malawi, and I didn't go anywhere where there were school children who didn't know who he was and adults talking about what he brought them. He's remembered there for his many endeavours, not just to end the slave trade or the trade in human beings, but he also brought education and medicine. And there's a very, very easily understandable Scottish education system in Malawi when you go to visit any of the schools. It's very familiar. I believe those things that David Livingstone fought for are worth fighting for, but they're never easy. And David Livingstone also said, if you have men who will only come if they know there is a good road, I don't want them. I want men who will come where there is no road at all, and I think the women would be joining him. Of course, of his first 12 years, he developed an anger for slavery, refusing to even follow in the same paths as the slave traders. As Livingstone again wrote, "It is so undesirable to travel in a path once trodden by slave traders that I preferred to find another line of march." The David Livingstone Centre is a jewel in Lanarkshire's crown. I'm delighted to see the local councillor Bert Thompson here. I'm delighted that future generations of Scots and visitors from across the world will continue to be able to learn about and gain inspiration from Livingstone's life and legacy at that centre, which is what I was treated to as a child. And it is that reason that I put my heart and soul into securing that future when the centre was under threat a few years ago, and we managed to secure that. A lot of joint work and great work from the staff too. So I am also very, very delighted that it's been given museum status. It's been a long time coming, and it should have maybe happened a long time ago, but we're absolutely great to have it now. I'm also very delighted that the Scottish Government has committed to celebrating this 200th anniversary. I think we should not forget about the roles that people played in forging Scotland in the world. I think, Presiding Officer, today and the rest of the month is a very fitting legacy indeed.
Thank you very much. I now call Jim Hume to be followed by Patricia Ferguson.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I too congratulate Bob Doris on securing this debate, and of course perhaps should note James Kelly also has a motion on Dr Livingston, which I supported before it was lodged. Bob Doris and James Kelly have declared my interest for me. My granny was a very proud lady, and one of her proudest facts was that her great-grandfather, which I think is my three-great-grandfather, was a cousin of David Livingstone. So I'm not quite a straight descendant, but I shall be descended from Dr David Livingstone's grandfather, if I've got my maths right. His name was Alexander Livingstone. He was also from Blantyre. He was a contemporary of David's. He too worked in the Blantyre mills, but as a weaver. And although you may think that David Livingstone's life was cut short early due to his foreign travels and malaria, dying at the age of 60, that ancestor of mine and cousin of David, Alexander Livingstone, he died sometime before he was 31. We don't know exactly when, because he was in the 1841 census, but not in the 1851. So he may have even been as young as 22. So mills in those days were not of the high standards for health and safety, so it's of interest that you'd think that David took the more adventurous and dangerous route in life, but managed to live twice the length of time than his cousin, who stayed at home to continue the family weaving tradition. So you can draw from that what you like. I think David's highly heralded as one of the greatest Scots that ever lived. So it must be surely true to say that despite being a man known for his various explorations, the greatest journey he travelled in life was the one that took him from his tenement in Blantyre, away from the mills that his family all worked in, to his interment in Westminster Abbey, alongside this island's great and good. His life was a true rags to riches tale, an inspiration to not only Scots but people everywhere. Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe. It takes a remarkable individual to slip free from the humble confines of early 19th century industrial Lanarkshire to achieve what he achieved. In his honour, his name's been adorned onto a mountain range in Canada, a city in Zambia, a town in Malawi, a college in the United States. The list goes on. But how did such a man from humble beginnings, who from the age of 10, as Alex Ferguson said, did 12-hour shifts as a piecer in a cotton mill, go on to achieve the legacy he did? I think one of his most memorable quotes perhaps gives us a measure of the man, and I quote, "I will go anywhere, provided it is forward." And forward he did go. Livingstone may have been introduced to the African continent to spread the word of God, but he would eventually abandon his mission of faith and go forward on a mission of exploration. And as a result, creates a legacy which has endured for 2 centuries. His expeditions were responsible for important geological discoveries, such as, of course, Victoria Falls. And I'll not embarrass myself by trying to pronounce the indigenous name for that waterfall. And it led to previously uncharted areas of the continent being mapped. It would be wrong to paint his life as a fairy tale, though. He would later come to regret not spending more time with his children. His expeditions were not always fully successful, and of course his wife Mary Moffat would pass away on one such expedition with malaria. So I think it's right and proper that we do commemorate his life on the eve of the bicentenary of his birth, and also for the President of Malawi to make a state visit to this Parliament next week is a wonderful honour and testament to the contribution David Livingstone made to 19th century Europe's understanding of Central Africa, and the impact he had upon not only my granny and my family, but on, of course, all those countries that he visited. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I now call Patricia Ferguson to be followed by Dave Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I also thank Bob Doris for securing this debate this evening. That we are debating the bicentenary of Dr David Livingstone is a mark of the significance of the man and the endurance of his legacy, both here in the UK and in Africa. Our own partnership with Malawi is a result of the relationship that he had with that country. For while many other former colonies and protectorates have turned their back on their colonial heritage, Malawi is still proud of its links to Livingstone and, through him, to Blantyre and to Scotland. And the strength of that relationship was brought home to me in 2006, when I had the privilege of visiting the David Livingstone Centre in Blantyre, that's the Scottish Blantyre, with 2 visiting Malawian government ministers. I was genuinely taken aback by how honoured they felt to have been able to visit the home of this legendary figure, as Alec Ferguson has also described his experience too. And it was extremely moving to see how moved they were to see for themselves the humble origins of one so important to the history of their nation and whom they regarded as a very great man indeed. And one of those ministers will return to Blantyre on Sunday as part of the celebrations of Livingstone's bicentenary, but she will visit this time as the President of Malawi. And I look forward to hearing President Banda's address to Parliament next week and of welcoming her back to Scotland. That Livingstone found himself in Africa at all was a historical accident. He had wanted to be a missionary in China, but the Opium Wars put paid to that. A geographical accident brought him to Malawi as he led an expedition to open up the Zambezi River. In fact, he actually spent very little time in Malawi, but what he did do was inspire many European missionaries to follow in his wake. Many of those missionaries were ill-equipped for what they would encounter, and many died not long after arriving, often of malaria and other tropical diseases. Whole families were often wiped out, and the devastation that was wreaked can be seen in the missionary graveyards to this day. Livingstone was a determined man, described on one occasion by his friend and companion John Kirk as possibly mad. And his reputation suffered ups and downs even during his lifetime. But then again, the reputations of most great men find that they are waning and waxing from day to day. But his stand against slavery must surely commend him to us. He himself described slavery as the open sore of the world, and he used his travels and his fame as a platform from which he could declare his opposition. Livingstone carried on his work when pain and disease would dictate to a less dedicated or determined man that they should stop, and he finally died, probably from the effects of a cocktail of tropical diseases in 1873. Presiding Officer, we rightly celebrate and praise Livingstone for his achievements and his legacy, but let's not forget his wife Mary, as Maureen Watt quite rightly said. The daughter herself of a highly regarded missionary, Robert Moffat, Mary was born in Africa and met Livingstone when he returned to her father's home at Kuruman in modern-day Botswana. He had been attacked by a lion, and Mary nursed him as he recovered from major injuries to his arm. They married a year later and set up home together. Following the death of their baby daughter, Mary returned to bring up their family in the UK. The Livingstones were married for 18 years, but spent half of that time apart. Mary died at the age of 41, only 3 months after returning to Africa to be with Livingstone, and was buried in Mozambique. And ironically, although Livingstone himself pioneered, as we've heard, the use of quinine as a remedy against malaria, Mary was too sick to benefit from it. Presiding Officer, Livingstone was a missionary, an explorer, a cartographer and a doctor, and he worked hard to understand the diseases he encountered in Africa. But sadly, some of those diseases, like malaria, are all still too common. The diseases that killed Livingstone, his wife Mary, and many of the missionaries he inspired still kill thousands of people in Africa to this day. In an excellent article, Michael Barrett, a professor of biochemical parasitology at Glasgow University, suggests that it would be a fitting tribute to David Livingstone if in 2013 we could finally see the tide turning against tropical disease. That seems to me the most fitting tribute we could make in this bicentenary year, and something of which I think Livingstone would approve.
Thank you very much. And finally, Dave Thompson, I have 4 minutes left for you to make your speech.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I also congratulate Bob Doris on securing this debate on the bicentenary of the birth of Dr David Livingstone on the 19th of March 1813. The list of his exploits and accomplishments are long. He travelled the Nile, explored the Zambezi and was the first European to lay eyes on Victoria Falls. Throughout his journeys, however, there was one defining feature of David Livingstone's life that stands out from the rest, and that was his Christian faith. The young David Livingstone grew up in a household surrounded by Christian values. David's father was a door-to-door salesman who gave out Christian tracts during his job and was a Sunday school teacher at church.
Mr Thompson, we can't hear you very well. Could you make sure that your microphone's directed? Thank you very much.
Is that better? Yeah, sorry about that. The young David Livingstone grew up in a household surrounded by Christian values. I'll just say it again so you get it this time. David's father was a door-to-door salesman who gave out Christian tracts during his job and was a Sunday school teacher at church. David emulated his father's love of theology and faith in Christ, but mixed it with a distinct passion for the sciences, which led him to studying medicine and also being ordained as a missionary. His father had a fear that reading science books would undermine his Christianity, and David's deep interest in nature did indeed lead him to investigate the relationship between religion and science. However, after reading the book Philosophy of a Future State by Thomas Dick, a young David reconciled his two loves of faith and science. He believed the two were not at odds with one another, but were both essential to a fulfilled life. David Livingstone went on to establish Christian missions in Central Africa and to become one of the most famous missionaries in history. His motto, which is now inscribed in the base of the statue to him at Victoria Falls, was Christianity, Commerce and Civilization. He saw his mission as being to open a path for commerce and Christianity. But it is important to note that his championing of commerce was not a colonialist one, but more to do with providing an alternative economy to the slave trade. He encouraged small groups of Presbyterian men and eventually their families to form communities in Africa that would bring their skills with them and pass them on to the local people. He saw this not as a means of European settlement, but as a transfer of skills and techniques and a way of Christian living. During his travels, he preached a Christian message, but would never force it on unwilling ears. David Livingstone also listened to the African chiefs with respect and courtesy, treating them as equals, in stark contrast to the treatment of the African people by many other Europeans. In taking this attitude, David Livingstone was acting just as he had learned in his readings of the Bible. 1 Peter 3:8 says, "Finally, all of you, live in harmony with one another, be sympathetic, love as brothers, be compassionate and humble." The First Minister recently said that David Livingstone's values were the values of Scotland, and I would agree. But of course those values were Christian values, and we should not forget that. At a time when it is unfashionable to admit that Scotland was once known as the land of the book, we could do worse than look back at the life of David Livingstone, a man whose values of humanity did not stem from humanism, but from a deep faith in Jesus Christ, a factor which was also instrumental in shaping who we were and are as a Scottish nation.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Humza Yousaf to respond to the debate. Minister, in 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to offer some closing remarks in today's members' debate. May I thank Bob Doris, to his credit, for bringing this very important debate to this chamber. Some fantastic contributions which I'll try to touch upon as I go through my closing remarks, Presiding Officer. But I was delighted to hear about Jim Hume's relation, great-grandfather relation there to the great man himself. When I first found this out a couple of weeks ago, I did say to Jim, to the member at the time, that I was not surprised but delighted to hear that he was cut from such noble cloth. But he reminded me quite correctly, as did James Kelly, that actually David Livingstone was the most humble of humble men, and even making his achievements even more remarkable. As we've been made aware through the various contributions, David Livingstone was one of our greatest explorers, but he embodied a thirst for education, as was mentioned by Alex Ferguson, but also enterprise and a capacity for endurance. But something that's been touched upon by almost every member, he was there as as a humanitarian, speaking against slavery. And this was a point that Alex Ferguson made very, very well, that at a time when it was not fashionable to do so, in a context where it's not fashionable. It's easy for myself and for other members across this chamber to stand up and speak up against slavery. But in those days, it was not at all popular. In fact, this was decades before Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, so he really was a trailblazer of his time. But he made a significant contribution to our understanding of the world. His legacy continues to this day with the strong relationship that we've spoke about between the people of Scotland and Malawi. In fact, the first debate I had the honour of opening and leading in this chamber as Minister was on Malawi, and every single contribution near enough touched upon David Livingstone. And I thought Christina McKelvey's contribution today, it reminded me of a contribution in that debate which was so passionate and enthused, clearly from that one visit to the centre. It's incredible to think of all the children that have passed through, and hopefully take that passion through, just as the member, I should say, has done throughout her life as well. On Sunday, we will be welcoming a delegation from the Republic of Malawi to Scotland to celebrate with us the birth of this great man. These bicentenary celebrations are an opportunity to celebrate those many achievements that members have touched upon. And the Scottish Government will be contributing almost £450,000 towards ensuring a sustainable legacy. £150,000 to the National Trust for Scotland to support the David Livingstone Centre and delivering the coordination of those Livingstone celebrations. In doing so, refocusing the nation's attention on that very important centre in Blantyre. It's not only David Livingstone's birthplace, but a focal point for understanding that legacy, both at home, I think, and abroad as well. And just on a side note, it was mentioned by Patricia Ferguson, that story of when David Livingstone was bitten by that lion on the arm, and then from there he was nursed by his good wife, Mary Moffat. And that's how he came to meet with her. And then, of course, he later married her. And I remember thinking at the time, and seeing that statue at David Livingstone Centre, there's definitely easier ways to get a woman's attention than getting bitten on the arm by a lion, but nonetheless, endurance is important. I also recently announced an additional £50,000, Presiding Officer, to the National Trust for Scotland to help develop the Livingstone 200 events in the course of 2013. This funding will open up, and has been opened up, to celebrations for the bicentenary for more people, community groups, grassroots organisations, and hopefully introduce David Livingstone to new audiences. Hopefully also help to increase awareness of volunteering opportunities as well. I would urge every member, if possible, to pass on this information of that fund to local groups in their constituencies. You can do by looking at the David Livingstone 200.org website. We've also provided other pockets of money as well, Presiding Officer, £140,000 to work with National Museums Malawi to provide content for the Dr Livingstone, I presume, exhibition, which I've had the pleasure of seeing. The funding will also assist in raising the profile and professional quality of museums and services by developing and implementing targeted skills. And that's important because what we also want to try to do is not just help Malawi, that we do through our International Development Fund, through traditional aid, but we also want to try to bring increased tourism, to increase the skill sector, increase the knowledge sector of Malawi as well. In addition to these projects, the Scottish Government has also provided £100,000 towards David Livingstone Bicentenary Scholarship. As Alex Ferguson, the member, touched upon quite rightly, David Livingstone was an educated man, but also understood that education was the route out of poverty. And so I'm delighted this programme will give gifted young women in particular, but underprivileged Malawian students the opportunity to study at Malawian further or higher educational institutes as well, in a range of subjects. A life-changing opportunity for young people in Malawi, where education, the educational attainment is one of the lowest in the developing world. And everybody has talked about David Livingstone's legacy, and it's important to continue that legacy. And I thought Patricia Ferguson made the point very well, very poignantly actually, in terms of the diseases that affected David Livingstone and unfortunately also killed Mary Moffat, are still very much alive and prevalent today. And the best legacy we can have is to try to eradicate that. And I think that's absolutely right, and that's a challenge that all of us need to face up to. But it's great, I think, to see that 200 years on from the birth of this fantastic Scot, that 200 years on, that legacy is being continued by none other than a young 9, or I believe she's 10 now, year-old girl, Martha Payne, who's going and using using modern-day technology to capture the imagination of people, to continue that legacy for the people of Malawi. So as a government, we look forward to the programme of events during the visit of the Malawian delegation to celebrate the bicentenary of Dr David Livingstone's birth, which has been put together by representatives of Scottish Civic Society, and I thank them all for their efforts. It is a testament to David Livingstone that his legacy retains such a power to motivate. And I very much look forward to the celebrations ahead, as I think many others do. And I wish those that are visiting Malawi on behalf of this Parliament every success. And I do hope you also take the Government's best wishes as well as the Scottish Parliament's. But I thank once again Bob Doris for bringing this debate forward, and as I say, wish these celebrations every success.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes Bob Doris's debate on Dr David Livingstone's bicentenary, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.